Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're focusing our lens today on something I know all of you are dealing with in your practice every single day. It's the link between digital screen time and myopia, and we've got some really fresh research here to kind of pick apart and dissect. Really brings this issue into focus, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, yeah, and it's a really timely topic too, with myopia rates just skyrocketing globally. I mean, we really need all the insights that we can get to help our patients.
Yeah, for sure. So the study that's really got us all buzzing right now is this systematic review and meta-analysis. It's by Hamar et al. And it was published just last month in JAMA Network Open. There are tons of these screen time studies out there. What makes this one so special?
Well, I think it's the sheer scope of the data. We're talking 45 studies, over 335,000 participants. I mean, this is a truly global sample.
Wow.
This data gives us a much more robust picture than just those smaller, isolated studies.
Okay, so big data, global perspective. I'm already kind of intrigued. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What did they actually find?
Well, one of the most eye-catching findings, no pun intended,
Oh, I was going to say it.
is the dose-response relationship they found. Basically, they found that for every additional hour of daily screen time, the odds of myopia increased by 21%.
21%.
Yeah, that's a significant jump.
It is.
And it really emphasizes the potential impact of screen time on eye health.
Wow, 21%. That is a stat that will definitely make our patients blink. What kind of screen time are we talking about here? Is it just smartphones, or does this include, computers and tablets, the whole shebang?
That's a great question. The study is actually pretty comprehensive. It looks at the cumulative effect of screen time from a variety of different devices. We're talking smartphones, tablets, computers,
Uh-huh.
even TVs and gaming consoles.
Okay.
It seems that it's the total exposure that matters most.
So it's like a digital buffet. Too much of anything can be a bad thing.
Hmm.
Um, did the researchers differentiate between the types of screen time, like passive viewing versus interactive use?
They did delve into that a bit. And interestingly, studies that combine multiple device types actually showed an even stronger association with myopia. This suggests that the variety of screen engagement might also be a factor.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about the quantity of screen time, but also the diversity of how it's being used. This is really interesting. When we talk about myopia risk, are we talking about kids primarily, or are adults at risk as well?
Well, you might assume that it's a bigger issue for developing eyes,
Right.
but one of the more surprising findings of the study was that the increased risk was actually consistent across all age groups.
Really?
Yeah, meaning we need to be thinking about screen time and myopia across the lifespan, not just in our younger patients.
That's a good point. We can't just focus on the younger generation. We need to be mindful of our own screen habits. Set a good example for our patients. Okay, so we've got this dose-response relationship, 21% increased odds per hour of screen time. I mean, what does that mean practically? Is there like a safe threshold, or are we all just doomed to a future of blurry vision?
Well, the study did suggest a potential safety threshold of under 1 hour of screen time per day.
Under 1 hour.
Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule, and more research is definitely needed, but it does give us a starting point for those conversations with patients about managing their screen time.
Under 1 hour. I can already hear the collective groan from teenagers everywhere.
Hmm.
But I mean, realistically, in our digital world, is that even achievable for most people?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where our expertise as eye care professionals comes in. We need to kind of translate these findings into practical advice for our patients. It's not about scaring them away from technology, but helping them find healthy balance.
So finding that sweet spot between, digital engagement and protecting our precious eyesight, it's a tightrope walk, for sure.
Hmm.
Now, I know no study is perfect, and there are always limitations to consider. So what are some of the caveats we should keep in mind when we're interpreting these findings?
Well, one limitation is that most of the studies included were what we call cross-sectional, meaning
Mm.
that they provide a snapshot in time
Right.
rather than tracking changes over time. So while we see a strong association between screen time and myopia, we can't definitively say that screen time causes myopia. More research is needed to kind of solidify that causal link, particularly longitudinal studies.
That's a crucial point, and it reminds us to be cautious about drawing, sweeping conclusions. Yeah. What about other limitations? Did the researchers acknowledge any potential biases in the data?
Another important consideration is that screen time was largely self-reported in these studies, which can be subject to something called recall bias.
Uh-huh.
People might not accurately remember or estimate their screen time, and that could potentially skew the results.
That's a fair point. I know I've been guilty of underestimating my own screen time on occasion, so we need to take this self-reported data with a grain of salt. But even with these limitations, I think this study offers some valuable insights. Would you agree?
Absolutely. It significantly adds to the growing body of evidence linking screen time and myopia. And it reinforces the need for continued research, but also empowers us to have more informed conversations with our patients about managing those digital habits.
Now, I know we've been throwing around some kind of technical terms here like dose-response relationship and sigmoidal pattern. Let's take a moment to kind of unpack those a bit further for our listeners.
Of course, the dose-response relationship in this case refers to the fact that as the dose of screen time increases, so does the response, which is the risk of myopia. And the sigmoidal pattern describes the shape of that relationship.
Sigmoidal pattern. It sounds a bit like something you'd see on an eye chart, right? Can you paint a picture for us? What does that curve actually look like?
Well, imagine a steep hill that gradually levels off as you reach the top.
Okay.
That's essentially what a sigmoidal curve looks like. In this context, it means that the risk of myopia rises sharply with increasing screen time initially, and then it plateaus after a certain point.
So it's not a linear relationship. That's a really helpful visual. I can already see myself sketching that curve for my patients to
Exactly.
illustrate the point.
Yeah. And that plateau is what hints at that potential safety threshold we discussed earlier. It suggests that while minimizing screen time is ideal, there might be a point of diminishing returns where additional screen time beyond a certain level may not significantly increase the risk further.
That's an important nuance to highlight because it offers a more realistic and less daunting perspective. For both us and our patients, it's not about eliminating screens altogether. I mean, that's impossible for most people these days, but about finding that balance.
Precisely, it's about promoting healthy habits and informed choices.
Now, speaking of informed choices, I'd love to hear from our listeners. What are your initial reactions to this 1 hour threshold? Does it align with what you're seeing in your practice? And how do you approach this whole screen time conversation with your patients? We'll dive into those questions and more after a quick break. But before we do, be sure to check out the show notes for a link to the full study if you want to really geek out on the data.
Welcome back, everyone. And before we jump back into our screen time discussion, I just wanted to add that the researchers, they weren't just looking at whether someone had myopia or not. They were also interested in how screen time might affect the progression of myopia over time.
So they weren't just looking at like a single point in time,
Yeah.
but how things might change as people continue to use digital devices.
Exactly, yeah. They were looking at the whole picture.
Okay, that makes sense. It adds another layer of complexity to this issue because it suggests that even if someone doesn't develop myopia right away, their screen habits could still have like long-term consequences for their vision.
Right, and that's why it's so important to start these conversations early and really emphasize the importance of healthy screen habits, from a young age.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, we've talked about the scope of the study and some of the key findings, but I'm curious about the methods. How did the researchers actually go about analyzing all of this data?
Well, they used a pretty sophisticated statistical technique called a dose-response meta-analysis, or DRMA.
DRMA.
Yeah, and this allowed them to examine the shape of the relationship between screen time and myopia risk, in detail, and that led them to that sigmoidal pattern we were talking about earlier.
So DRMA is basically a way to kind of combine and analyze data from multiple studies to get a more comprehensive understanding of a particular relationship.
Precisely. It's a really powerful tool for synthesizing evidence, identifying patterns that might not be apparent from individual studies.
And it seems like this DRMA approach was particularly well suited for this research question, just given the vast amount of data that they were working with.
Exactly, yeah. It allowed them to kind of tease out those nuances in the dose-response relationship, like the plateau we were talking about, which, might have been missed with a simpler analysis.
Okay, so we've got this robust methodology, this massive data set, some pretty compelling findings. But as we've mentioned, it's crucial to consider the limitations. We've already touched on the reliance on self-reported data and the cross-sectional design of most of the studies. Were there any other caveats that the researchers highlighted?
Well, they did point out that there's still a lot we just don't know about the specific mechanisms by which screen time might contribute to myopia development and progression. There's ongoing research into various factors like the role of blue light,
Hmm.
near work, and even the impact of reduced time spent outdoors.
So it's a complex puzzle, and we're still putting the pieces together.
Exactly. And while this study provides a significant piece of that puzzle, it's not the final word. There's definitely a need for further research, to delve deeper into these underlying mechanisms and explore potential interventions.
Now, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the different types of screen time. Did the researchers find any differences in myopia risk based on the specific device being used, or was it more about the total screen time across all devices?
That's a really great question. It seems that, in general, it was more about the cumulative effect. However, there were some interesting findings regarding specific devices. For example, the study found that using smartphones for prolonged periods, was more strongly associated with myopia than using computers for the same amount of time.
So even though the overall message is about total screen time, there might be some nuances based on the type of device and how it's being used.
Exactly. And this is where our clinical judgment comes in, right? We need to take these findings and apply them to the individual needs of our patients. So, if we have a young patient who's spending hours every day on their smartphone, we might want to have a more focused conversation about reducing their smartphone use specifically.
That makes perfect sense. It's about tailoring our advice to the individual patient and their specific habits.
Precisely. It's not about a one-size-fits-all approach. It's about personalized care.
Now, another aspect of this study that got my attention was the lack of a significant difference in risk between different age groups. You'd think younger eyes might be more susceptible to the effects of screen time, but that wasn't necessarily borne out in the data.
Right. And that raises some really interesting questions about the long-term implications of screen time. If the risk is consistent across age groups, does that mean that early exposure to excessive screen time could have lasting consequences for eye health, later in life?
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. It highlights the importance of early intervention and kind of setting healthy habits early on. But it also underscores the need for more research to really track these long-term effects.
Absolutely. We need to keep digging deeper to understand the full scope of the impact that screen time has on our vision, across the lifespan.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about and discuss. I'm sure our listeners have plenty of questions and insights of their own. So we want to hear from you. What are your initial reactions to this research? Does it align with what you're seeing in your practice? And what strategies are you using to address screen time with your patients? We'll be back after a short break to delve into those questions and more. All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm sure many of you, can relate to the challenges of just discussing screen time with patients. It's like pulling teeth sometimes. You know what I mean?
It can be a really tough conversation for sure. Yeah, especially with younger patients who often see their devices as, extensions of themselves.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And let's be honest, even as eye care professionals, a lot of us struggle to manage our own screen time. So how do we even approach this topic with our patients in a way that's both informative and empowering?
I think the key is to start by just acknowledging the reality of our digital world.
Mhm.
We can't simply tell people to ditch their devices. That's just not realistic.
Right.
Instead, we need to frame the conversation around, healthy habits and finding a balance.
So more like a digital detox than a complete digital shutdown.
Precisely, yeah. It's about helping patients understand those potential risks of excessive screen time,
Right.
but also empowering them to make informed choices that align with their lifestyle and their needs.
Right. And that's where this research comes in handy. It gives us some concrete talking points like that potential safety threshold of, under 1 hour per day. Now, I know we've emphasized that this number isn't set in stone,
Right. Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's still a helpful benchmark to start the conversation, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's really important to explain that this threshold really applies to leisure screen time. We're not talking about, screen time for school or work, which is often, unavoidable.
Right. That's a good distinction to make. We don't want to create like unnecessary anxiety or guilt around screen time that's essential for, education or employment.
Mhm.
So focusing on that leisure screen time, what are some practical strategies we can actually recommend to patients who are, actively trying to cut back?
Well, one of the most effective strategies, and this is supported by a growing body of research, is encouraging more time outdoors.
Okay, yeah.
Studies have consistently shown that spending time in natural light can actually help protect against myopia development and progression.
So less screen time, more green time. I like it.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be, hours and hours outdoors. Even just short bursts of time in natural light can make a difference.
Right, yeah. Now, for those patients who are, just glued to their devices,
Mm.
what are some tips for managing screen time during those inevitable indoor hours?
Well, the 20-20-20 rule is a classic for a reason. Every 20 minutes, take a 20-second break to look at something 20 feet away.
Right.
This helps relax the eye muscles and prevent eye strain.
Simple but effective.
Yeah, and I've also found it helpful to just remind patients about proper ergonomics, making sure that their workstation is set up correctly, taking breaks to stretch and move around, and adjusting screen brightness and contrast. All of these can make a difference in reducing eye fatigue.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about good old-fashioned sleep, right?
Yeah.
Making sure that patients are getting enough restful sleep is essential for overall eye health, as it allows the eyes to really recover and repair themselves.
All great points. And I think it's important to emphasize that these lifestyle changes, they aren't just about preventing myopia, they're
Mhm.
about promoting overall health and well-being.
Couldn't agree more, yeah. It's all interconnected. Taking care of our eyes is part of taking care of ourselves. Well said. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful, and I'm sure our listeners have, gleaned a lot of valuable information to take back to their practice. For those of you who want to explore the research in more depth, you'll find a link to the full study in the show notes. And don't forget to follow the podcast for more, eye-opening discussions on all things eye care. If you found this episode helpful, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star rating and tell your colleagues about the show. Until next time, keep those eyes sharp and those minds engaged.